Here's how Pendulum Monsters work. Pendulum Monsters are half monsters, half spell cards that can either be summoned or placed in the Pendulum Zone as a special kind of continuous spell card called a Pendulum Scale. Unlike most monsters, whenever a Pendulum Monster card would go from the field to the graveyard, it instead goes to the extra deck face up unless otherwise stated. And when a player has 2 Pendulum Scales active, they can conduct a once per turn Pendulum Summon of as many monsters as they want from either the face up extra deck or the hand. However, these monsters' levels must fall between the numbers listed on each Pendulum Scale, and you can only Special Summon Pendulum Monsters from the face up extra deck to either the extra monster zone or link zones that you control. Now, at first glance, Pendulum Monsters can be spotted among other Yu-Gi-Oh cards quite easily. Like any monster, they have obvious levels, attributes, and stats, but have a mixed color border and reduced card art window to accommodate the additional Pendulum Scales and second text box. In general, Pendulum Monsters have 2 effects. Their monster effects are listed in the lower text box, and their spell effects are listed in the upper text box. However, some Pendulum Monsters have no effect when activating the Pendulum Zone, while others may even be normal monsters with effects when scaled or have no effects at all. While Pendulum Monsters are often loathed for their seemingly endless walls of text, you can often shortcut the amount of reading you have to do when you encounter a new Pendulum Monster by looking out for some of these common themes. First, does it restrict the player from Pendulum Summoning or Special Summoning in some way? And if not, is there a clause that changes that Pendulum's monster scale under certain conditions? Second, is it part of an archetype? Pendulum monsters with extremely unique effects often share their quirks with other monsters of their archetype, and a large part of their text is just explaining how that archetype's gimmick works. Lastly, is it a Pendulum Xyz monster? All Pendulum Xyz monsters have lengthy clause that you can skip that simply explains that it can be Pendulum Summoned face up in extra deck despite having a rank as opposed to a level. Speaking of the face up extra deck, knowing where Pendulum monsters are supposed to go can sometimes be confusing since it can change depending on how they're used and where they're moving from. As a general rule, Pendulum monsters go to the extra deck face up whenever a non-Pendulum monster in the same scenario would leave the field and go to the graveyard. However, if a card like Macrocosmos that states otherwise is on the field, that card takes precedent over the default game mechanics. In this and other similar cases, any Pendulum monsters that would go to the extra deck face up are banished instead. When using Pendulum Monsters as materials for extra deck monsters, understanding the rule that requires Pendulum Monsters to move specifically from the field to the graveyard is essential. While Pendulums intuitively go to the face up extra deck when used for Synchro or Link summoning, when used as materials for an XC summon, Pendulum Monsters do not go to the extra deck face up if they are detached. While this is a bit counterintuitive, it's because XC's materials are not considered to be cards on the field. Therefore, since these Pendulum Monsters are being sent to the graveyard from somewhere else that isn't considered the field, they do not go to the extra deck face up. Using Pendulum Monsters as fusion material similarly requires you to pay close attention to where the monsters being used as materials are coming from. If you activate Parametalfoes Fusion to fusion summon a Metalfoes Fusion monster using cards from your hand, field, or face up extra deck as material, then any monster used from the field will go to the extra deck face up. But any monsters used from either the hand or face up extra deck will go to the graveyard. The most obtuse ruling of all regarding Pendulum Monsters and whether they go to the face up extra deck or graveyard is easily taken by what happens to them when the summon of a Pendulum Monster is negated. While it may appear that a Pendulum Monster in this situation is moving from the field to the graveyard, in this instance it does not go to the face up extra deck and instead goes to the graveyard. This is because a monster whose summon has been negated is considered to have never been summoned and therefore has never touched the field. Monsters in this scenario, including Pendulum Monsters, are immediately sent to the graveyard without the designation of having come from the field, hand, extra deck, or any other named location in Yu-Gi-Oh! This can be extremely frustrating after conducting a large Pendulum Summon, since all of the summoned monsters will be sent to the graveyard instead of the extra deck if your Pendulum Summon is negated. Speaking of Pendulum Summoning, in order to conduct a Pendulum Summon, a player must have 2 active Pendulum Scales in their Pendulum Zones, one with a high numbered scale and one with a low numbered scale. When a player is referring to their Pendulum Scale, they could be referring to one of 2 things. Either they're referring to a Pendulum Monster scale in the Pendulum Zone, or specifically the number listed on that Pendulum Monster. In the first case, a Pendulum Scale is any Pendulum Monster card that has been activated or placed in a Pendulum Zone, and the action of activating a Pendulum Monster in the Pendulum Zone is unofficially referred to as scaling. While placed in a Pendulum Zone, a Pendulum Monster is treated as a continuous spell with the effects listed in its upper text box, with continuous effects being applied upon resolution and activated effects becoming available for activation. It should be noted that a Pendulum Monster being treated as a continuous spell or trap in the Spell Trap card zone do not have access to their Pendulum Scale effects unless they have been explicitly placed in the Pendulum Zone. While this isn't a common occurrence, it is something that can occur and that Pendulum players should be aware of. In the second case, a Pendulum Scale refers to the 2 numbers on the left and right of the card next to the red and blue scale markers. While this number technically indicates the scale value the card will have in each respective Pendulum Zone, every Pendulum Monster currently released has the same number on both sides. However, there isn't any written rule that says this will always be the case, and Konami has previously shown interest in this as a potential pendulum design space. Since both a low and high scale are necessary in order to conduct a Pendulum Summon, a Pendulum Monster's scale numbers can sometimes be even more important than its effects. A scale of 8 or 9 is great for a high scale, and 1 is the golden standard for a low scale. While scales higher or lower than these do exist, they're typically considered overkill and unnecessary. Having a scale of 2, 6, or 7 is considered okay. But pendulum monsters with a scale of 3 or 5 have to have really good effects to offset their limited use in the pendulum zones. Pendulum monsters with a written or changing scale of 4 are given this scale as a deliberate downside. These cards often have incredibly powerful effects that warrant restrictions, and giving a pendulum monster scale of 4 is often enough to balance it out. Once your scales are set, to conduct your pendulum summon, you simply have to declare it and then special summon as many monsters as you want from your hand and extra deck, so as long as you follow a few key rules. To start, you can only pendulum summon monsters whose levels are between the numbers listed in your pendulum scales. For example, if you have Performapal Monkey Board and Performapal Celestial Magician scaled, you can pendulum summon monsters with levels between 2 and 7, since Monkey Board scale is 1 and Celestial Magician scale is 8. This is why having a pendulum scale of 4 is so bad, since it prevents you from pendulum summoning level 4 monsters, the most commonly used level in the game. Next, pendulum monsters being summoned from the extra deck must be summoned to either an unoccupied extra monster zone you can summon to, or to link zones that you control, with a link zone being a zone that a link monster points to. This is a restriction left over from Master Rule 4 and used to apply to all extra deck summons, but now only applies to pendulum and link monsters as of the introduction of Master Rule 4 revisions. Lastly, monsters from the hand cannot be pendulum summoned to the extra monster zone, and the monsters you pendulum summon must be generically special summonable. While there are edge cases where this won't be true, in general, if you special summon a monster using Monster Reborn, that monster can also be pendulum summoned. This rule works for almost any monsters being summoned from the hand, and extra deck pendulum monsters being summoned from the extra deck. Since just like a normal extra deck monster being special summoned from the graveyard, extra deck pendulum monsters must be properly summoned before they can be pendulum summoned from the face-up extra deck. Similarly to built-in special summons of cards like Cyber Dragon and Kashtira Fenrir, pendulum summons don't activate and therefore don't start chains until the summon is complete, and the monsters are already on the field. Due to the quirks of pendulum monsters and pendulum summoning, finding the best ratios for cards in pendulum decks can work a bit differently compared to non-pendulum decks. There are two general philosophies that have emerged regarding how pendulum decks should be built. While you should always play your starters at 3 just like any other deck, the ratios of which extenders, consistency tools, and non-engine staples should be played is where the two ideologies diverge. On one hand, you have the standard deck building practice of including all of your best cards at 3 to maximize the probability that you draw into those cards in the first turn. Pendulum decks built this way are incredibly consistent at performing their main combo lines and building endboards, but are unable to play more than a handful of non-engine staples, if any at all. This is because pendulum summons are 3-card combos by design, and most pendulum combos require you to start with at least 2 different pendulum monsters in hand. However, the best boards are often built by 3, 4, and even 5-card combos that utilize most or all of the cards in your starting hand, setting up loads of interaction to protect your board while constantly interrupting your opponent. While the consistency boost provided by opening 5 engine pieces is great for playing through interruptions when going first, pendulum decks built this way are an immense disadvantage going second, and often struggle to break boards when left uninterrupted. On the other hand, pendulum decks can also be built on the other extreme by focusing on the amount of advantage a single card can generate. These decks leverage the few 1-card pendulum starters that are available by maximizing their starters, minimizing their extenders, and jam-packing the rest with non-engine staples in an attempt to increase their consistency going second. While this style of deck increases combo fragility and reduces the ceiling of your end board compared to a pile of 3 of engine pieces, it's balanced by the sheer power of non-engine staples like Nibiru and Kurikara that have the potential to win you the game on their own. While both styles of pendulum deck building have their pros and cons, in the end, which style you pursue really comes down to either metagaming the current format or personal preference. Regardless of what pendulum deck you're building or how you're building it, there are a few generic pendulum and anti-pendulum staples that you should be aware of. Beyond the pendulum is a link to spellcaster with the effect to search any pendulum monster from your deck when link summoned to the extra monster zone, and can target and destroy any 2 cards in the field when 2 monsters of different levels are pendulum summoned to zones that it points to. This card is so good in pendulum decks that they usually played at 2 copies, both to insulate against extra deck ripping effects and to aid in rebuilding the board on turn 3 when going first. Arcfiend Eccentric is a level 3 fiend that has the pendulum effect to destroy itself and any other spell trap on the field, and the monster effect attributes itself to target and destroy another monster on the field. The ability to flex between monster and back row removal is so good that non-pendulum decks will sometimes include Eccentric on the side, but its pendulum scale of 7 makes it even better in pendulum decks as a way to either play through interruption or break your opponent's board. While currently banned in the TCG, Master Duel players specifically need to be wary of Heavy Metal Foe's Electromite, a Link 2 Psychic monster that functions both as a generic consistency tool and extender for pendulum decks. Upon Link Summon, it has the effect to add any pendulum monster from your deck to your extra deck face up, and has the activate effect to destroy any card you control to add a pendulum monster from your face up extra deck to your hand. Both of these effects are soft once per turns, with the only hard ones per turn being its mandatory draw upon a card leaving your Pendulum Zone. Moving on to the anti-Pendulum staples. Anti-Spell Fragrance is a continuous trap that requires both players to set spell cards before activating them, and prevents spell cards from being activated until a player's next turn after they were set. Since Pendulum Monsters can only be activated in the Pendulum Scales and cannot be set, Anti-Spell Fragrance is often seen as an instant win card against Pendulum decks, locking them out of their Pendulum effects and Pendulum Summoning. Dimensional Barrier is a normal trap card that requires you to declare either Ritual, Fusion, Synchro, Xyz, or Pendulum to negate that type's effects on the field and prevent either player from special summoning monsters of that type for the rest of the turn. Similarly to Anti-Spell Fragrance, flipping Dimensional Barrier and calling Pendulum is actually even better than the currently banned Vanity's Emptiness against Pendulum decks, effectively skipping their turn entirely by locking them out of special summoning. ERADICATOR Epidemic Virus is another popular normal trap that, by attributing a dark monster with 2500 or more attack, allows you to declare either spell or trap to look at your opponent's hand, all spell traps they control, and all cards they draw until their third turn after its activation, and destroy all cards of the declared type. While this seems like it wouldn't hurt Pendulum decks very much since they're primarily made up of Pendulum Monsters, this is far from reality, as Pendulum Monsters in the Scales are considered to be continuous spells. This allows ERADICATOR to destroy your Scales at any time, as well as any other starters or extenders you might be holding on for later. In general, Pendulum decks also have a hard time in formats where main deck spell and trap card removal is viable, and having an important summon on your Pendulum Summon negated by a well-timed Solemn can be devastating, since Pendulum Monsters will go to the graveyard if their summon is negated. Overall, Pendulum Monsters are an extremely unique design space that is exclusive to Yu-Gi-Oh! And can lead to fun and interesting situations that are vastly different from what non-Pendulum decks provide. Despite their lack of recent meta relevance, they should still be kept in consideration as a potential contender in the future on the advent of new support. Alright, and that's everything you should need to know to get started with Pendulum Monsters. If there are any details about Pendulum Monsters we missed, other generic support or anti-support Pendulum cards you think are important, or if you have any ideas for future videos like this one, please leave your ideas in the comments below.